It's Miss Marsden. I'm going to take you through your lesson today about competition and adaption. So this is still part of the biology topic, and you should have completed your booklet last week on interdependence. So what I want us to be able to do by the end of this week's lesson is to be able to give examples of adaptations in terms of behavioural, structural and functional adaptations. I want us to be able to suggest factors that organisms are competing for with given information. And I want it to be able to identify and explain how organisms are adapted to live in their natural environment. So before we start, usual things: turn off your phone, don't have any other tabs open, answer all the questions. So you need this week's booklet in front of you. Again, always rewind the video if you do miss anything, if I do go a little bit too quickly. And don't give up on it before you've finished. If you do ever have any questions that you've struggled to understand, please do make sure that you email your class teacher with specific questions based on what you have struggled on. For example, can you please explain a surface area to volume ratio to me in more detail? Like, we cannot pick up on every single mistake that you may have made in these booklets. So anything that you do get stuck with, please can you point it out to us, and we're more than happy to help. So, first task for today, what I'd like you to do is to complete your fluency test, which is the first page in your booklet. So pause the video for as long as you need to. You should be getting used to what these fluency tests are expecting of you, and please do make sure that you're going to mark this using the mark scheme which is in the science folder for this week. So today's first task about this lesson, there's an exam question in your booklet, and what I would like you to do is I'd like you to answer that exam question to the best of your ability, and I'd like you to pause the video for as long as you need to. We're going to go through this together on the next slide. So please mark your answer out of 5. This is based on what we did for the last couple of weeks. If you did the higher booklet, there's only a few of you which will have done this. The mark scheme is here, so pause it for as long as you need to improve your answers. So, new content for this week. Competition. Basically, in addition to being dependent on each other within an ecosystem, organisms have to compete with each other, both within their species, like in the image at the top, or across species, like the other two images. For example, the tree and the grass are both in competition for the sunlight. So you need to know that animals compete for food, water, territory and mates. I would make a note of that because it is a recurring theme throughout the rest of this topic. Plants are slightly different. They compete for light, photosynthesis, minerals, water for photosynthesis again, and for space. You can't grow, for example, too many trees in one place because they need enough space for their roots. In addition to what the organisms are competing for in the two lists I've just given above, there's competition in terms of predators, migration and disease, which can also affect the populations of each species. Please remember that a population is just one type of species, for example wolves, whereas a community would be all the organisms within an ecosystem. So, to be able to survive to the best of their ability within an ecosystem, all organisms have some sort of adaptations. Adaptations are any features that enable an organism to be a better competitor and more likely to survive within their environment. So, like we said in our outcomes, there's 3 types of adaptations that you need to be aware of, and all adaptations that an organism has fall into one of 3 categories. So the first one is structural, so that's physical features. For example, a polar bear has white fur. Functional, and that's how the body operates. So for example, a chameleon can change colour based on where it is. A behavioural adaptation is related to the behaviour of an organism. For example, hamsters are nocturnal and they only come out at night, and that means they're less likely to be eaten by predators. So I just gave one example for each, but here's some other examples. So you've got bright colours which warn of poisons. You also get some animals which have bright colours but they're not actually poisonous themselves. And what that does is it makes predators think that they're poisonous, so the predator is less likely to eat them. Camouflage, so they can blend in. And we've got things like talons, claws and sharp beaks, and that's all good for catching prey. And you could also say they're good for defending themselves against predators, for example, in the case of a porcupine which has sharp spines on its outside. I want you to pause the video here and then come up with a list of many examples of structural adaptations that you can. The next one is behavioural adaptations, and they're the ways in which organisms behave that aid their survival. So examples are hibernation, so going to sleep for the winter so you avoid the cold weather. Migration does the same thing, so you move somewhere else to avoid a negative climate, for example. Hunting in packs like wolves do is an example of a behavioural adaptation. Huddling, and that's what the penguins in the image there are doing. And then being active only at night, so that's known as being nocturnal as well. So I want you to pause the video and then come up with as many examples of organisms which fit into each one. For example, what sort of organisms hibernate? What sort of organisms huddle? So take as long as you need to do that. It'll just help you develop your understanding even further. Last one is a functional adaptation, and that's the ones affecting the way an organism works internally. So, for example, sweating or not, humans are very lucky that we are able to sweat, and that helps us to keep cool in lots of different environments. Why is that good? It means that we can run further in a hot climate, which was a benefit for early humans because it meant that we could hunt better. Having a lower metabolic rate during hibernation basically means they won't starve. Making poisonous chemicals, so plants do that. A cobra, for example, a cobra snake makes poisonous toxins, which helps it hunt prey as well. So try and come up with some of your own examples if you wish to help you develop your understanding further. So we've talked about in general what our 3 types of adaptations are. So we're going to link this to specific climates now. So animals in cold climates must keep themselves warm to survive. So in terms of the structural adaptations, you can probably see from the images already, you can have a guess at what they are. But thick fur coat, keep them warm. Thick layers of blubber under the skin, so that's fat, and that provides a layer of insulation for the animals. And they also, you'll notice they have round body shapes and their legs are close to their bodies in terms of they have short, stumpy legs usually. And what that does is it gives it something called a small surface area to volume ratio. So please make a note that SA to vol ratio, it means a surface area to volume ratio. In a cold climate, you want that to be as small as possible. And all that means is there's a smaller surface area of skin being exposed to the environment. You want that to be as small as possible because that reduces heat loss. So make a note that a small surface area to volume ratio helps reduce heat loss. That's good because it keeps you warm when it's cold. They also have small ears as well. For example, a penguin, you can't see its ears. A polar bear's ears are tiny, as are the Arctic fox on the left there. Compared to a fox which lives in a warmer climate, their ears are much smaller. So on the flip side, we've got animals in hot climates. They want to keep themselves as cool as possible. So they have large, thin ears, and that helps them to radiate heat. They have little body fat because they don't need that layer of insulation to keep them warm. The fur is thin and it's usually sandy coloured, as you can see. And they have like a longer body shape and long limbs as well, and what that does is it gives it a larger surface area to volume ratio. So a large surface area to volume ratio increases heat loss, which is good in this instance. So large surface area to volume ratio increases heat loss. Another adaptation of animals in hot climates is they need to conserve water, so they tend to produce very little urine and they're most active at night when it's cooler. That reduces the chance of them dehydrating and overheating. Obviously that one there is a functional adaptation. Going into more detail about our surface area to volume ratio, because this probably is the hardest bit about this topic. So, heat loss takes place at the surface of an animal's body. That's where you lose most of your heat. So, in a cold climate, it's important to restrict heat loss. And then on the flip side, it needs to be made easier in hot climates. So, if we think about an organism in a cold environment, we're thinking about the pink cubes on the left. And what that has is all of the surfaces within that, effectively they're being covered more. If you compare that to one at the bottom, the one at the bottom will have a smaller surface area to volume ratio compared to the separate cubes, but the cube on the left has got the smaller surface area to volume ratio because there's less surface being exposed to the environment around it. So if you've got less surface exposed to the environment, then there's less heat being lost to the environment, so you're going to stay warmer. But if you've got a large surface area to volume ratio, you've got loads of your surface exposed to the environment, and that means it's easier to lose lots of heat, which is good if you live in a hot climate. So basically, this cube here, that's in my cold environment, and the separate ones would be representing organisms that live in a hotter environment because they've got a larger surface area to volume ratio. So if you need to calculate surface area to volume ratio, so an example of a question in terms of applying your understanding of how to calculate this is at the top. It says, Use a calculation to decide which one of these two animals below lives in a hot climate, and then you need to explain your choice as well. So to calculate the surface area to volume ratio, it's really straightforward. All you need to do is you need to divide the surface area by the volume. So I need to put 540,000. You can do the same thing with your calculators. And then you just need to divide it by the volume, so 180,000. And that will give you 3. So this being 3 and this being 1, so we've got a 3:1 surface area to volume ratio. So I'd like you to do the same thing for animal number 2. So you should have got 20 and then your ratio 20:1. So which one has a larger surface area to volume ratio? Animal 2 has a larger surface area to volume ratio. So that's good because a large surface area to volume ratio aids heat loss, and we're looking for the animal that lives in a hot climate. So they need to lose heat in a hot climate, so we know it must be animal number 2. You're very welcome to write your own questions using this as a model to help you calculate your own surface area to volume ratios, but it's as straightforward as that. Remember, a large surface area is good in a hot climate, small surface area to volume ratio in a cold climate. So, what I'd like you to do, you've got 3 organisms on the slide. I'd like you to please tell me what the structural, functional and behavioural adaptations there are for each one. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult to come up with the behavioural and the functional adaptations just by looking at a picture. You can use the internet to research this. So pause it for as long as you need to. So we're going to move on to talking about plants, because plants are slightly different. So in a desert, there's 3 kinds of adaptations you really need to know about. So you have things like cactuses, and they look like they don't have leaves. So all of them don't have like lush leaves that you'd see on a tree in Leeds, for example. And that's because the leaves are usually curled up to form spines or spikes. That's because leaves lose a lot of water through the large surface area. So if you think about a large flat leaf, it has got a really big surface area for water to evaporate from. But if you compare that to a spine, there's much less surface area to lose water from. And that's because they have much less of the little holes at the bottom of a leaf, which are called the stomata. There's much less of them being exposed to the environment, so there's much less area for water loss. If you're a cactus as well, spines are good because they'll protect you from predators and things eating you. It's the same for this plant too. All of these plants will also have really deep roots because the further down you go underneath a desert-like area, the more likely you are to find something called groundwater, which is just a source of water deep underground. So in the leaves we talked about small surface area to volume ratio, and that's just a summary of what we just talked about. Plants can also have waxy leaves, and the layer of wax on top basically stops water from evaporating as much. Cactuses are also so thick and chunky because that's the stem. If you think about the stem on a dandelion, for example, it's much thinner than on a cactus. That's because the dandelion doesn't need to store water, whereas a cactus does. They've got those roots which are very extensive to absorb as much water quickly, and you can have deep roots to get to groundwater as well. Make sure you have an understanding of all of the adaptations which a plant in a desert climate has. So, on the image is a muskox, and they live in the Arctic. What I'd like you to do is use the information and the photograph to explain 2 ways which a muskox is adapted to survive in the Arctic. So I've got one example here. I'd like you to come up with 2. So my example that I'm going to give is I'm going to say he's got long fur, and I'm going to say that's for warmth. Please come up with 2 more. So you should have come up with 2 more. The mark scheme's here, so you just need to be looking at the left-hand column. So you should have come up with any in terms of the fur being long and thick. It's got a large round body to give it a small surface area to volume ratio. Small is better in a cold climate, and that prevents it from losing heat. Short legs, again, reduces the surface area to volume ratio. Same thing for small ears. And top marks if you came up with the horns for defending itself, and that's usually talking about from members of its own species, so other males in its species. Give yourself a mark out of 4, please. So last thing we need to talk about is extreme environments. So an organism that lives in an extreme environment is called an extremophile. Basically, they can survive in an environment that would kill most other organisms. So they've got usually really high temperatures, really high concentrations of salt or really high pressures, and you'd always usually find these quite deep under the water. So you're only thinking about simple organisms in this case, like bacteria, as some sort of fish. But an extremophile is an organism that can survive in a very, very extreme environment. So what I'd like you to do, in your booklet there are 2 exam questions. You've got 12 minutes to complete them, please. I'd put a timer on your phone maybe or on your computer and try them to the best of your ability, please. The mark schemes will be in the booklet, which is going to be in the science folder. So, how does this link onto future learning? Basically, in terms of how these adaptations have developed, it's by something called natural selection, which you might be familiar with. If you want to go away and look further into natural selection, please do, because it will help you understand this further. So that's due to random changes in the DNA, and those random changes basically lead to an organism surviving, but you don't need to know that into too much detail for now. So, these extended response questions, please don't feel pressured to do this. This is completely optional. It is a stretch task for those wanting to really improve their skills in terms of 6-mark questions. These adaptation questions, basically, they are like the easiest marks you're ever going to get on an exam. effectively in terms of a 6-mark question. This is a jackpot if this comes up because it's such easy marks. So in the booklet, what you've got is 2 separate questions, and for each one there's 2 separate answers. So you have a good one and you have one which is not so great. So what I want you to do is, for the first question, I want you to tell me, why did candidate 1 get 6 marks, whereas candidate 2 only got 2 marks? So I want you to pause the video now and then tell me a success criteria for getting 6 marks on these questions. So what have they done which have allowed them to be successful? So if you look at the answer for candidate 1, effectively what they do is they've directly answered the question. So you just need to lay it out in a similar way to the question we talked about in the muskox. So state what the adaption is, so describe it, say what you see. So for example, the muskox has a round body shape. So that's my description. And then you need to go into your explanation and say it has a round body shape because this reduces the surface area to volume ratio. This reduces heat loss, which is beneficial in a cold environment because. So you then go on to say, because you need to lose as less heat as possible, effectively what will happen if not. So make sure you describe what is it, explain why does it have it. So for this to be successful, make sure you've explained how the adaptions help them to survive in the environment specified. So if it says in a cold environment, don't talk about a camel basically. And make sure that if it just talks about animals in a specific environment, you only talk about animals. And if it talks about plants, only talk about plants. Okay, make sure you read the full question, it's so important. So there's 2 questions at the end of the booklet which you can have a go at. And if you want to submit those to your teacher for feedback, please do. Again, if you have any specific questions about anything that's come up in this lesson which you don't understand, I really recommend that you just email your teacher with a specific question. We'll happily help you with it. Please don't assume that we can spot these mistakes if you send us a picture of a piece of paper, because sometimes they are quite difficult to find. Thank you again for completing this lesson and well done. Please remember to mark everything using the mark scheme.